So I'm Doug Midori from Dyn. Hence the shirt, please do not DDoS us. This is a talk about BakConnect's suspicious BGP hijacks. This is kind of an updated version of the talk I gave last fall. And there's a, let's see, there we go. There's a bit of setup in telling this story. This was some work that I did with Brian Krebs. So the way the story begins is Krebs put out this blog at the beginning of September last year on this entity called VDOS. And VDOS was a DDoS for hire service. You would pay them some money to go and attack something, and these guys suffered a breach. Krebs had gotten a hold of what was, all the gory details of their operations. Who were the clients that were paying them to attack, and who were they attacking, how much, all the details of those. I wrote that up, and in the course of doing this investigation, had noticed that this very small 2 or 3 person U.S. security company had performed a BGP hijack, like on the same day that he put this blog out of one of VDOS's control nodes. And so he reached out to this company, BakConnect, and asked them, he had met the CEO previously, and asked them, what was the story here? Why were you hijacking this thing? And so they came back and said that they answered him by saying that this was a BGP hijack that they had performed for the purpose of intercepting the traffic to this control node to understand who is behind attacks that were either affecting them or their clients. And it's worth noting, I do a lot of BGP research, and I've written about a lot of the incidents around BGP, and this is probably the first time that we've ever had a perpetrator of a BGP hijack concede the reason that they had performed this BGP hijack for the purpose of intercepting traffic, which is something that we typically assume is happening, but we've never had somebody come out and confirm it. And then, in addition, use this explanation that this was actually a justifiable act as a defensive act, which is something that it's a philosophical debate that people can have. So here was just a bit of analysis on the actual hijack that we saw. The BakConnect is AS203959, or at least they were when I gave this talk, because they've since changed. And so VDOS was using this Verdina hosting out of Sofia, Bulgaria for one of their control nodes. This is a visualization I like to use to try to convey routing propagation of some sort of routing phenomenon. So the x-axis is time. It gives us a sense of duration. The y-axis is peer percentage. So we have about 400 BGP peering sources that give us live feeds of their tables. And so in this timeline, then I can kind of get a sense for just roughly how much of the internet was accepting this route and for how long. And so it was about 50 minutes, and about more than half the internet accepted the route. And then another piece of data that we use to investigate internet performance and measurement is trace routes. We actually run hundreds of millions of trace routes every day. And anytime there's some sort of a routing incident that occurs anywhere, invariably we have trace routes that were sucked into the event, and then we can go and look and pull them out and study what actually transpired. In this case, we can look at a trace route from our box in AWS in Ashburn, Virginia to this Verdina hosting in Sofia, Bulgaria. Normally, it would take this path where Cogent would take it onto Europe and onto Sofia, Bulgaria. During the hijack, this was rerouted. It went over to, instead, Comcast, and then to Voxility, where Voxility took to Los Angeles, where BakConnect was announcing it out of one of their POPs. Now, Voxility shows up a lot in this talk because BakConnect was essentially using them for their DDoS mitigation services that they were selling. And this is what some of the smaller players in the space do, is they just kind of pass off some other larger entity, larger DDoS mitigation provider as their own services. And so anytime in any of these AS paths or trace routes, they're always going through Voxility to get the BakConnect. All right, so after I did a little bit of analysis on this, Krebs and I teamed up on just trying to understand what was the history of these guys, because actually when we look back for a year, there was actually quite a lot of other activity. They had kind of claimed this was kind of a one-time thing that they did. Turns out that was not the case. There's actually quite a bit of other earlier activity. So Krebs did his side, where it was his more traditional gumshoe investigative journalism. He had uncovered at least one entity to go on record. There were a couple others that we were aware of. An entity that went on record saying that BakConnect had approached them to sell them DDoS mitigation services. They demurred. And then, according to the VDOS logs that came out, these guys had hired the VDOS guys to attack guys, the customer, and then come back and say, how about now? You want to buy DDoS mitigation services? So Free Software Foundation went on record saying that they had experienced this. That was his reporting. My side was just looking at the routing stuff, and so that's kind of, I gave a couple samples of that here. So this was one of the notable hijacks that occurred. There's a BGP hijack of Staminus, and so there's a connection between BackConnect and Staminus. Staminus is another very small U.S. Security firm. The CEO of BackConnect had come from Staminus just weeks prior to this hijack. In a couple weeks after this incident, Staminus suffered a very big breach, and all their innards got taken out. In that information was the fact that this /24 was an important control node to the Staminus network. So people have wondered aloud if there's a connection between these, and I unfortunately don't have anything definitive. I just know that this particular hijack took place, and there's some interesting things about it. So basically, I've got a bunch of AS paths in these, and so if you're not used to looking at BGP data, the way to interpret these are, I'll skip over this one. It's a sequence of integers. Each one of these is an autonomous system, and the rightmost AS is supposed to be the origin, assuming it hasn't been forged. And then entities get added to the left, so you read it kind of right to left, and then the traffic would flow in the opposite direction, going back to the origin. But there's nothing to prevent somebody from re-editing or manipulating these AS paths. And typically the state of the art is people just check what the rightmost AS is for what's the origin. And that's if you can change that, then you can obscure who's actually announcing these routes. It takes a greater level of analysis to figure out. At some point, these forged AS paths have to reach the real internet, and at that transition point, then it starts to behave like how we would understand it, and we can find where was the point where it changed from forged to real. In this case, they were adding all these ASs to the left side of the AS path, and Inabate, I guess, is some other small security firm. They were trying to make it look like they were the origin. They then came back and did another hijack minutes later, where they actually had Staminus, make it look like Staminus was actually the origin of this route, which they weren't, with this 25761. And then these next two ASs to the right were the two transit providers that Staminus was using at the time. It was GTT, which is 3257, and then Telia, which is supposed to be 1299, but they typoed it, I think, and this is it's actually 1229, and this typo gets carried through in some of their other hijacks. This is another one. Initially, they start announcing this hijack as themselves. So everything on the left for all these AS paths, that's always 3223, which is Voxility, and then 203959, which is BackConnect. Initially, they were announcing it as themselves, and then switched over to announcing it as very briefly, just for a few minutes, as if it was Staminus announcing this, and then going through a couple of transit providers, one of them being Telia typoed as 1229. So they have forged a number of AS paths here, and I could keep going, but these are the last couple examples. On the left is the first one. The A example is as if the AS was coming, the route was coming from 4134, which is China Telecom. Now we've got a lot of peering in China, and we can say definitively that this route did not come from China Telecom. And then moments later, it changed to coming from Hurricane Electric. That's 6939. We also have a lot of peering with Hurricane Electric. It definitely wasn't coming out of them either. So these were very clearly forged. A couple more examples on the right. So the other interesting thing that I came back when I looked at this past year of activity by these guys in this work with Brian Krebs was I had come across this fairly sizable BGP routing leak. And so a routing leak is when an entity mistakenly announces routes to an adjacent AS that they're not supposed to. That's a general or a generic definition. There's a lot of subcategories of this. So on May 28th, they had leaked about 13,000 routes. And this happens, routing leaks occur every day, and there are mistakes made, and typically they are not noteworthy. They do have the effect of shifting traffic, so typically they will go redirect internet traffic through the leaker. And so there are security implications. And given that this is a company that has now conceded that they were manipulating BGP for traffic interception, it makes this routing leak kind of interesting. It puts it in a different light. So I added it in this analysis. And in these graphs, this tan part are kind of like the propagation of these routes coming out of BackConnect. In this case, they weren't the origin, they were just, it showed up as an upstream, so a slight distinction. And then I mentioned those hundreds of millions of trace routes we run every day, and we had thousands that were sent, that we had sent that got redirected into Voxility and BackConnect and onto their final destinations. So this was, they were suddenly added into the path from one point to another. Like I said, there are security implications to that. So BackConnect in the BGP pantheon of incidents, this is kind of the first time that we had an incident where the perpetrator of the attack conceded that they had done this deliberately to intercept traffic. The CEO of BackConnect had gotten in touch with me after we published this stuff in September and said, all right, fine, all this stuff took place, but it was an employee that's no longer with the company. And so we're all good now. And so buyer beware with them. There's an interesting, larger observation just from a guy who does a lot of BGP analysis that there are a lot of players now doing this BGP-based DDoS mitigation that, and every few weeks I discover another one that's getting into this space. It used to be years ago, it was just Prolexic that was doing this, and they were kind of the pioneers in this space. And there's been, other companies like Neustar or VeriSign are also, reputable companies trying to kind of replicate what Prolexic does. And these days, there's lots of little guys that are also doing this. And this getting into the space of BGP-based DDoS mitigation is essentially a license to hijack address space. And hopefully, you're doing it, as at the behest of your customer. But there is certainly a lot of room there for abuse if for smaller actors that people don't know much about. And then last fall, I posed this question for the routing community, this nano community, this is where you go to talk about BGP issues. Could there ever be a justifiable scenario to hijack somebody's address space? Could it be that somebody was so bad that you had to do something and you had to take matters into your own hands? The answer from that audience was an emphatic no. These are the purists of the global routing system. But I can imagine some grayer scenarios, either where law enforcement is involved. I think there's been a number of cases where people are aware that law enforcement has directed things like this, or maybe it's not, and you have no other recourse. It's an interesting question to ponder. So there's a couple of epilogues here to this. So Krebs and I put our stuff out in about mid-September last year, and that was immediately following these blogs were the beginning of this IoT-based attacks. So this is what triggered the attacks against Krebs, and he was down for a week or more, and eventually he had to get dropped off of Prolexic and then over to Google Shield. About a month later, I gave this talk about my collaboration with Krebs, and then we also got attacked pretty bad. Maybe you're familiar with the attack that we suffered on 10/21, and for that attack, there are some competing theories. I don't have anything definitive to know the motivation behind it. I can say this, that having just presented this to a very large audience on this subject matter at that time, it sure felt personal that we were taken out just within hours of discussing this. And like I said, there's competing theories. I don't have anything definitive on that. I would say that Krebs has got a lot of enemies. He does good work, but there's bad guys that don't like that guy. And so helping him out, I think, comes with some risk. Despite that, we still help him out. And so when he got into trying to unmask the Anna Senpai guy, this is, if you have time and Krebs isn't down due to some record-breaking DDoS attack, it's a good blog to read. These things are so long that he writes. An important detail in this was it was one of his sources had said that there was a BGP hijack that he had participated in, and so he kicked it over to me to see if I could verify it with some very vague criteria to go find. And so I never put anything out. This is all that the form it took in his blog. I never tweeted or blogged anything on this, although sometimes I do. This was kind of what we saw, and so the background is kind of not so important, but It was basically, this was back in, this was all gaming stuff. It was like Minecraft server guys attacking each other. And the Forged AS path was this long one here on February 2nd, 2015. It had a bunch of phony ASs thrown in, like the Gay Men's Health Crisis, I guess, has an ASN, and International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. So whoever's putting this together is some sort of homophobia baked into the Forged AS path. And then came back with the following day, hijacking again with the origin being 1337 leet. So we all know you're really leet if you use that number. But anyway, so that is that's a summary of the collaboration that I did with Brian Krebs last fall. And like I said, got the shirt. Go easy on us. Don't want to get DDoSed. All right. Thank you very much.